Sonia, it's so good to have you again, just to chat a bit more about some really tough topics. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. I just keep reading some of your articles, and every time I think Sonia really gets what's happening in the world out there. And I think just your research and your background, your postgrad degree, and also just your journalism has just really helped to help us look in a more detailed way at some of what's happening in the world today. We've looked at different countries, haven't we, like Azerbaijan through to sort of North Africa and sort of West Africa, and now moving into places like Egypt, then on to UK, the United Kingdom. So I was just wondering if you could just share a little bit of what you know is happening on the ground in Egypt with Islam and the sort of intersection between Islam and Christians, what's happening with Christian families, and some of the work that you have been doing with Christians from Egypt.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Beth, for taking the time to listen to these stories. These women and girls need our attention. So I'm really grateful that you opened up your YouTube space to discuss these matters. Egypt is not necessarily a country many people think of when we think of Christian persecution. I think it stays under the radar. But I've just finished last January a research report for an NGO called Coptic Solidarity. Copts, by the way, are the Christians, the largest group of Christians in Egypt.
And that's interesting you say that. I did talk to a Protestant Egyptian, and he was saying how Coptic is also sort of almost like ethnicity as well.
Right, yes. They are the indigenous people of Egypt. So from before the time it was Arabicized.
Yeah.
There now are some evangelical Christians, often newly converts. There's also some Coptic Catholics, but these are really small. There's also a Greek Orthodox Church, by the way, just thought about that. But I would say that the largest Christian community in Egypt is the Coptic Orthodox Church. So yes, I've just, for an NGO called Coptic Solidarity, I have done a research report on the abduction, forced marriage, and forced conversion of Coptic Christian girls and women.
And it's an area we don't normally hear about. We hear about that happening in other parts of the world, but not so much in Egypt. We know there are issues in Egypt, but not that there's forced conversions or kidnappings of Christian girls and so on.
Right. And this is also the stumble block, so to speak, because many politicians over the years have asked me, saying, do you have proof? And I remember when I was at the UN in 2023, and Coptic Solidarity was also there, but I wasn't working for them back then. So the demand from Westerners, from Western policymakers, politicians, for proof is it's very problematic. First of all, it puts the pressure on the victims rather than, a state prosecuting, sorry, the perpetrators.
That's actually in Islam, in the Quran, isn't it? Where there's the verse that talks about, or the idea that women have to provide lots of witnesses. If she has been falsely accused or some accusation, she has to provide four witnesses, for example. And this is a real problem for girls who have been raped because they can't provide four witnesses. Or even if it was gang rape, the men would not come forward and admit to it. So it's caused huge problems for victims, hasn't it, in the Muslim world?
Extremely. And yes, you're right. It's in the Quran, it's also in Sharia, roughly speaking, Islamic law. There's Sharia covers a lot of other parts as well, like prayer and fasting, but a part of it is also law. So yes, so that is problematic for women and girls in Islam, but also women living under Islam, such as the Copts in Egypt. The idea of proof is also a very Western idea because we think that you just walk into a police station and you report a case. But these women and girls or their families are actually prevented to report the missing, the abduction of their daughters. And that's very problematic, obviously, because that means there's hardly any official documentation on these cases. And it's like a circle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Then people say, well, there is no proof. No, because they're not allowed to report cases. So it's very complex and it's very dark. If I may give you one example how that works, I know from a young woman that I've interviewed for this research report. She was 25 when she was taken. She was undressed in the police station. They were trying to make her confess that she had been sleeping around with men. So trying to make her ruin her own reputation, so to speak. So these are some of the intimidating tactics that are used.
And would also the
Very
laws of Egypt hinder as well families who have gone to the authorities for help? Say a child has been taken. Is there situations in Egypt where the authorities will not help the Christian families?
So first of all, there is the law. So we think Egypt is so trying to end child marriage, so they say, in 2030, and they have changed their law, but the law leaves loopholes. And one of the loophole is that, yes, the law does state that you're not allowed to marry. So boy or girl before the age of 18. But actually, the law allows for a husband to marry a younger girl, but not register, not formally register the marriage. Then he just needs to sign a paper that, of intention, that he intends to legalize everything by the time she turns 18. But it allows him to marry her before her 18th
Is he
birthday.
allowed to live with her as if he's a husband, or does he
Yes.
sort of, yeah, under, and the Egyptian authorities wouldn't take him to court or anything?
So this is very problematic, as you can imagine, specifically because in Islam, such a thing as marital rape doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So a Coptic girl who has been taken and forced to marry and forcibly converted to Islam, first of all, marital rape doesn't exist. So how do you get gender justice, as they call that today? It's a very popular word today.
Mhm.
But also, and that's a very important thing, is that one of the girls, for example, young woman rather, she was married when she was taken. And then her husband was invited to become a Muslim. Otherwise, his marriage with her would be annulled upon her conversion. Now, you and I both know that is Sharia. Uh,
Yes, and it's
that
also
is in
seen
Islamic
in
law.
Muhammad's life.
Yeah.
There, one of the wives that happened to where the marriage was annulled, and then that woman became one of Muhammad's wives.
So you recognize the patterns, right?
Absolutely,
That
yeah.
then in everyday stories from our contemporary world, people can say, oh, what you're talking about is centuries ago. No, it's happening today.
And if you are a Muslim, you would have to sign up to Muhammad, who married a 6 year old, consummated the marriage when she was about 8 or 9. And that's been the story that's been held for many, many years. So if you're a Muslim, you want to follow him as your example, then you would implement that into your own life if Muhammad is the example for all time, which the Quran says he is. So
Yes.
for a Muslim, they would abide by that law, even if there's laws in the land that would stand against it. And we see some of that happening in the UK with polygamy, for example, and men having many wives, even though it's actually against British law. But they would go with the Islamic law and have the marriages under the Islamic courts in Britain, and they wouldn't register those marriages with the British courts at all. And so it's caused a lot of problems for girls because they are quite vulnerable in this country. If they're a second, third, fourth wife, they're not recognised by the British government, and as a
Exactly.
result, there's some real issues happening amongst some of the Muslim communities here.
Exactly. And those vulnerabilities you see in Egypt,
Mm.
and because they not necessarily just the Egyptian government, but also other NGOs or organizations, politicians, they were saying it is all made up, that these things are not happening. So I did a country profile, and actually, Egypt has the highest percentage of sexual abuse in the region, in the Arab region.
Wow.
And other women, so not necessarily Coptic Christian women, but for example, refugee women from the Sudan, from Yemen, from Syria, also mentioned, and this was documented, I think, in an Amnesty International report, were also sexually harassed, sexually intimidated, in some cases even raped at the police station,
Oh.
some when they were trying to report rape. And there's also an issue with rape in Egyptian prisons. So to just say that all of that happens because Amnesty government reports, a lot of people have documented that.
What would they say were the reasons for it? What, or they were just highlighting it?
They were just highlighting it. But going back to the Copts, so nobody speaks about the Coptic situation. So this is why I titled the report Hidden Crimes, Public Deception. Because the Copts, their vulnerability, because of these reports never mentioning their situation, keeps them under the radar, and everything that happens to them, the atrocities, that they are suffering, happen under the radar because nobody talks about it. But it is well backed up when you see how these things, that's a pattern in Egypt, not necessarily only with Copts, but they're the only group that everyone neglects.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting. So why is everything else true except for what these communities are saying? That is
And
what
it
I
seems to be
believe.
quite widespread. We're not just talking about one little group of people in one town or one area. We're
No.
talking about quite a widespread situation across the whole of Egypt. And multiple and different Christian women and girls are talking about the same sort of treatment.
Yes, and one other important issue is, for example, that some reports that I have analyzed, they mention that because these women don't wear an Islamic veil, they stand out.
Quran
The
does say, doesn't
targets.
it, that women are to bring the veils across
Right,
them so they will not be bothered. It actually
right.
specifically says that, so they will not be harassed or bothered. They have to bring their veils sort of across them.
Right. So, yeah, so this is what happens. Some girls do manage when there's a lot of publicity. Social media is great for that, for example. When there's a lot of publicity, then sometimes girls are returned to their families.
Okay, that's good. We have to pray more our return. And is it
Yes,
quite endemic how many have been kidnapped, really, is what it is, isn't it? And
they're being
enforced
kidnapped.
marriages.
I would say a few hundred each year, and it's been going on for decades. So that's a
And would
large.
it be like a grooming gang situation? In England, there's a real grooming gang situation where a young man will be sent out to meet one of the girls to become a boyfriend, and then suddenly she's ensnared. Often they're plied with a lot of alcohol or drugs and then passed around lots of different men, sometimes within the same family. Is it that kind of scenario, or does it look a little different in Egypt?
Both. It is actually the country where I myself, because I've studied the grooming gangs a lot as well. It's Egypt is the country where I've always said that there's a connection, a similar pattern with the grooming gangs. And that is because now the law has changed with regard to, for example, child marriage. Instead of just taking girls, just kidnapping them, they start grooming them. But this can also, as in the UK, by the way, this can also be just being friendly to them when they're insecure or when they're perhaps having issues at home. It's not always the case, but it happens. Very often, a Muslim woman will befriend them first, and then they're married off to someone else.
The woman is part of it, wanting this girl to become
Yes.
to marry, say, a brother or something like that.
Right, or a cousin. But one other problem is also, and this is why I think that Christianity as a whole, the churches most certainly need to pay attention, because what happens with the grooming is that young girls, so you're not allowed to marry a girl under 18, right? So some of the girls are actually abducted or groomed to leave their houses when they're 18, but the grooming starts before that.
Yeah, when they're 15 or something.
Very young age. And one of the things that they do is make a Coptic Christian girl doubt her Christian faith. And they target her for hours on end on WhatsApp or other social media platforms, and with very deep, difficult theological questions. Now, I know who I was at 15. I don't know who you were, but at 15, I wasn't able to explain the Trinity to someone. That sort of really deep theological questions.
I've heard a
And
lot of Christians speak about our teenagers and our children need to be
right,
deeply happy about the Bible and to know how to answer questions because there is such a challenge coming in. And from Muslims, often from Muslim friends at school, for example, in Britain, and our teenagers are struggling sometimes to respond. They have the answers, but they just don't know them.
right.
To get
Yeah.
our next generation of young people equipped is really, really important.
Yeah, so that you see that happening in Egypt as well. But to be fair, Beth, there's also abduction. So I am aware of the situation of a girl who was abducted from college, university campus in broad daylight. I have been told from family members of a girl who was in hospital, a young woman rather, with her young baby boy, and she went home to get dry, clean clothes, and then she was never seen again. So these things also still happen. And one of the things that's really important is also that some women are made persuaded to sign a document in which they hand over authority to a Muslim man. The power of attorney, it is called.
Because she's become a Muslim.
Right.
Just thinking back what I've read in Islamic law
So she now
would
is a
be
guardian.
yes, yes. And as a Muslim, a Christian cannot be in charge of her. It would have to be a Muslim guardian over her and
Right.
her own new Muslim family. So Islamic law doesn't help the Christian families who've lost the girl.
Exactly. And another problem is, and that was one of my key findings, is that apart from the marginalization and discrimination that Copts are under, living under in Egypt, they even target the most vulnerable women from within that marginalized group, women with mental health issues such as depressions or epilepsy, making them obviously really vulnerable to these men. And the Egyptian government just does not have any interest in protecting these women.
A little bit like the UK.
Right,
I mean, they are now
unfortunately,
beginning to realize, oh, maybe we need to do something, but it's taken them a long time.
and under a lot of pressure, public pressure, because otherwise I doubt the UK would have gone this far. And we're not there yet. But yeah, we see the same thing in Egypt. There's the law of the land, but it says that I think it's Article 2 or 3 of the Egyptian constitution that states that Sharia is the law of the land. So all of these things are really difficult for Egypt's Coptic Christians to get their women back, but also to prevent, when there's more punishment, when more perpetrators would get prosecuted, it would probably help. But now I don't think anyone has ever been prosecuted for this or actually convicted,
Mm.
and leaves them like, yeah, I'm sorry to say, lame ducks.
Yeah.
You can just target them because there's no help, no escape route for them.
Some of the
You,
girls are
you
18 in the West would go, oh, well, they're 18, so they're
right.
their freedoms when people are not looking at the bigger, rather horrendous situation of what's been happening with these girls, and to get them to that point where they will leave the family, go into Islam, but actually there's been a real method of, in a sense, brainwashing or getting them into a difficult situation like the girls we have in Britain. And a lot of people turn a blind eye to the girls in Britain because they were seen, oh, well, they're on the streets, they're out late and they've chosen this. And yeah, they did fall in love with some of these boys. Some of them fell in love with some of these boys. And then, boom, they were in a terrible situation they couldn't get out of.
Yeah, but falling in love in my book doesn't mean you want to, be sexually exploited,
Yeah,
does it?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
So it's almost what you call gaslighting, right?
yeah.
And yeah, so you see this also happening in Egypt, and then the communities are really, really harshly intimidated and threatened. And I mean serious death threats.
Threatened from whom?
Perpetrators, but also I've heard stories, women shared stories where policemen said you to a family that went to the police station to report the missing of a girl, you better go home and you better not talk about this. And they do play along with the perpetrators because there's no real investigations. And I know from a previous report that was done by Professor Clark, she did one in 2009 and one in 2011. And I know that a father, a Coptic father, was told at a police station by a police officer, I have better things to do than go and look for your infidel daughter.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So that gives you, you know, an idea of what is happening and how much this community has been silenced. Yeah, it breaks your heart.